Hey everyone, this is David Brown, and this is the first video of a series where I go through Raptor photos from the Ashland Hawk Watch Fall 2023 season. The main purpose of these videos will be to give identification points to help you better learn to identify the raptors that are common in eastern North America. The Ashland Hawk Watch is located in the Piedmont region of northern Delaware, and this video will cover the photos from the first half of September. This photo is our view from the Hawk Watch, and it includes our new sign. Okay, jumping right into the photos, here are the first migrants of the season. Here we see two birds that appear to be the same size. We can see that this one shows fairly pointed wings, so maybe we should be thinking falcon. We also see that the cheek has a bit of a sideburn to it, this vertical line here. And we see that the birds are somewhat pale underneath. So these are small falcons. These are American kestrels. Here's a bird that's sort of two-toned underneath. We see a lot of brown or black here, but also the actual flight feathers of the wing and tail are more of a silvery color. We also see that the head appears to be pinkish or red because there's no feathers on it. This is a turkey vulture. Here we have another American kestrel that shows some of the field marks a little bit better. Again, we see the really pointed wingtips that falcons show, and you have that distinctive facial pattern as well. And we see some vertical streaking on the breast of this bird, indicating that it is a female. Here's a bird where we see the wingtips are more rounded. They're not real pointy like we saw on the kestrels, and just the overall appearance of it, we should be thinking that this is a hawk. And the first things that jump out to me are these dark bars here in the shoulder area, sometimes called patagial bars, and also the dark belly band here in the center of the breast, which contrasts with the white upper breast. So it's a distinctive belly band and dark patagial bars. Those are indicative of a red-tailed hawk. Now we see that this bird does not have a red tail, and it does not have a dark trailing edge to the wing. So that indicates that this is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here's another American kestrel. Notice that facial pattern that the other one showed, but this one underneath we just see some dotting, and we also see that there is some orange in the tail, so that indicates that this is a male American kestrel. Here's a bird where the photo quality isn't the best, but it does seem to have some orange color underneath, and we also see this really distinctive black and white pattern to the wings, like black and white striping, especially near the wingtips here. We also see that the tail, or at least what we can see of it sticking out here, looks dark, and maybe we see a faint white band across the tail. If we look at the wingtip, we see that it's rather blunt. It's more squared off. It's not real pointed. Those field marks combine to make this an adult red-shouldered hawk. Here we see a topside view of another red-shouldered hawk, so you can see the red or orange color to the shoulders. And the tail here we see is dark with thin white bands, like white lines on a chalkboard. Here's another closer view of an adult red-shouldered hawk from underneath, so we can see that orange coloration a little bit better, as well as the black and white patterning in the wings and tail. And also notice that the wings look a bit ragged. We see some feathers are longer than others, and that's just a sign of molt, which is pretty common in the early fall. A lot of the birds you see at hawk watches are molting, which just means they're dropping feathers and then regrowing them. This photo shows two different kinds of hawks, and we can easily identify both of them, even though the one in the background is really blurred. But first, let's start with the one on the left. So what we see here is a bird that doesn't have much marking underneath at all, and there's a certain amount of variability in this species. This is on the more lightly marked end. But what else do we see? Well, if we look at the overall shape, we see that it has kind of a medium-length tail. It's not the really long tails that we might see on the accipiters like the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk, but just the overall shape and length of the tail show us that this is in the Buteo genus. Now, we also see the wingtips look really pointed, just the way it's holding those wings, and that's typical for this species. So this is actually a juvenile broad-winged hawk. In the background, we see another Buteo species, and we can see the main field mark is this red tail. So this is a red-tailed hawk. Now, in addition to that, we can also see the other field marks of red-tailed hawks. So we can see those dark patagial bars here in the shoulder area, and even get a hint of that dark belly band. And along with the red tail, we see the dark trailing edge to the wing, which indicates that it is an adult red-tailed hawk. Here we have the top side of a raptor, and if we look at the head, we see that it's kind of a combination of white and black. The rest of the top side is pretty much brown, but we see that there's a lot of white dotting along the top side, which actually indicates that this is a juvenile bird. And if we look at the overall shape, even though the angle of the photo is not showing the shape the best, we still get the impression that this is kind of a lanky bird. So this is actually the top side of a juvenile osprey. Here we have the underside of an osprey. So whereas on top they were really brown, underneath they're really quite white with some black contrasting areas. Here we see a hawk that's in a glide posture. So we see that it's pushing the wrists forward a bit and it has its tail closed. But we do see some distinctive field marks. The main thing that stands out to me is the belly band here in the center of the breast. So it's a clean upper breast and then a dark belly band, and that usually indicates red-tailed hawk. Now, all red tails show the dark patagial bars, but you can barely see them in this photo, so that's not much of a useful field mark in this case. And we see that this bird does not appear to have a solid red tail, but rather it's more of a brownish tail with some banding, and we see no dark trailing edge to the wing. So those indicate that this is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here's the underside of another hawk, and it's pretty plain overall underneath, but we do see that it has some brown streaking underneath. It certainly doesn't have that distinctive belly band in the middle of the breast like we saw on the red-tailed hawk, and it also does not have dark patagial bars. Another thing to look at is the wingtip. We see that the wingtips are made out of 1, 2, 3, 4 feathers, and that is indicative of the broad-winged hawk. And in this case, because of the underside streaking, that indicates that it is a juvenile. Now let me mention that for buteos, so red tails, red shoulders, broad wings, normally we think of the adults as having the dark trailing edge to the wing, but juvenile broadwings sometimes show quite a bit of dark to the trailing edge, so don't let that throw you off. Here we have a hawk that looks like a flying cross. So we see a really long tail. We also see a head that sticks out quite a bit and kind of long, lanky wings. So it's like a big flying cross. A couple other things we can look at. It looks like it has vertical streaking underneath. And when I say vertical, I mean if this bird were perched up in front of you, that streaking would be vertical. Obviously, when it's sideways in the photo, it looks horizontal. Another thing that we see is that the outer tail feathers are shorter than the central ones. So you can see the outer tail feather ends here, and then they get longer, longer. So it gives the tail a bit of a rounded appearance. All of those field marks come together to make this a juvenile Cooper's hawk. This one should be an easy one. Again, we see that bright red tail, so right away that tells us that this is a red-tailed hawk. But also look for the other field marks. Again, we see those dark patagial bars here in the shoulder area, as well as that dark belly band. And since it's an adult, it also has a dark trailing edge to the wings. Here we have a large raptor that is mostly dark underneath, but has a white head and white tail. So right away we should be thinking that this is a bald eagle. Although this one isn't quite a full adult yet, we can see that the tip of the tail still looks fairly brownish, maybe a little bit of brown still in the head, and on the underside here we have maybe some white splotches remaining. So give this bird another year or so and it'll look like a full adult. It takes bald eagles about 5 years to get that full adult plumage. Here we have two birds of the same species, and the main thing that stands out to me is the shape of the bird. It's a really compact looking bird, especially look at how short that tail is. Another thing is that the bird is pretty much completely dark underneath, except for here at the wingtips you have these silvery patches. If we look at the head, it's pretty much a gray head. So this is actually a pair of black vultures. Here's another hawk in a glide posture. We see some dark here in the patagial area, as well as a belly band. So this should be telling us that it is a red-tailed hawk. And it looks pretty pale underneath. It looks like there's no dark trailing edge to the wing. Can't really judge the color of the tail that well from this photo, but we see enough here to tell us that this is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Here we have a somewhat distant bird, but just look at the overall shape. Really, really lanky. Look how long, skinny, and angular those wings are. And the overall color pattern is white and black. This is an osprey. Here we have a large raptor that's pretty much dark, but it does have a lot of splotchy white spread throughout the underside. We also see that it has a really large bill and a fairly large head. So this is a bald eagle. And this is a second-year bald eagle. And one interesting thing is that in their first year of life, bald eagles have longer wing feathers, and then over the next couple years they replace those feathers. So when you get a bird that's a second year or a third year, you get a mix of those longer juvenile feathers along with the shorter feathers that have replaced them. So for example, here you can see 2 long feathers and then a shorter one, and then the longer ones that are still retained, and then some shorter ones. So sometimes by looking at that pattern of how many long feathers there are versus short feathers, we can age the bird. So in this case, it's still the mostly long juvenile feathers, but it has replaced a few of them already, letting us know that this is a second-year bird. Here's a raptor that's black and white underneath and quite lanky and angular. This is an osprey, and you can see that it's missing a feather here in the wing, which creates a bit of a gap. Here's another hawk where the tail gives it away. This is an adult red-tailed hawk, but again, we can double-check those other field marks, including the dark patagial bars. And remember, none of the other Buteos show those dark patagial bars, and the belly band as well. So we know red-tailed hawk, and the adults have the red tail and the dark trailing edge to the wings. Here's a bird that comes across as really large and bulky, but we also see these pointed wingtips. So the pointed wingtips make us think falcon, and our largest falcon is the peregrine falcon, which this is. Here's a closer look at a peregrine falcon. Again, notice those pointed wingtips. And this one is a juvenile, so if it was perched upright, the streaking on the breast is vertical. And also notice the distinctive sideburns on the face. Here's a raptor that can confuse people at a hawk watch, because normally when you see this species when you're out birding, they're hunting low to the ground. So it looks quite a bit different when it's up high overhead. But looking at this bird, we see that it's kind of brown and tan overall, and that the wings are fairly long and lanky and pointed. And the face looks somewhat like the face of an owl. So this is actually a northern harrier. And based on the color, I would say that this is a juvenile. The first thing that stands out about this hawk is that it has a long tail. So immediately we should be suspecting that this is one of the accipiters. Remember, we saw the Cooper's hawk earlier, but this is actually a different species. So if we look at the tip of the tail, actually it's a little bit notched, which is indicative of this species. We talked about on the Cooper's hawk that the outer tail feathers were shorter than the central ones, which gave the tip of the tail a more rounded appearance. This species often shows a more squared off or even notched tail tip. We also see that the head, although in this posture it is sticking out quite far, it's a somewhat small head. And we see that the wings don't look as long and lanky. They have a little bit more of a curve to them, especially the bulge here in the secondary feathers. So it's a little bit differently proportioned than we saw in the Cooper's hawk earlier. So this is the smaller cousin of the Cooper's hawk. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. Here we see another hawk with a long tail, but which one is it? Is this a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk? Well, the one thing from this angle and this quality of photo that you can see is that the outer tail feathers are shorter than the central ones. So you can see the tail feathers ending here and then getting gradually longer until you get to the central one. So again, that's usually a field mark for the Cooper's hawk. And we see that this bird has orange horizontal barring on the breast, orange or kind of brownish, and that indicates that this is an adult Cooper's hawk. Here we have a somewhat small raptor, and what do we see? We see pointed wingtips. We see a little bit of a facial pattern to it, kind of pale underneath, maybe a little bit of streaking on the upper breast here. And the tail is orange or brownish with streaking on all of the tail feathers. So that actually makes this a female American kestrel. Here we have a raptor that is black and white underneath and really angular shape to the wings. This is another osprey. Here's another raptor with a fairly long tail, so we should be thinking the accipiters. So is this a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk? Well, let's look. The head looks really small. We also see that the tail looks really squared off, and that the wings look not long and lanky, but more short and compact and bulging. So this is a sharp-shinned hawk. Here we have a bird that looks like it has a really small head compared to how long the tail is, and we see that it must be banking quite a bit, the way it's banked over and the sun's hitting the underside of the wings, and it looks like it's holding its wings up into a little bit of a V shape or a dihedral. So this is actually a turkey vulture. And again, we see that two-toned pattern where you have a lot of dark here on the underside of the body and on the wing coverts, but the actual flight feathers of the wing and tail are this more silvery color. Now, one thing about this bird, look how clean it looks. If we look at the trailing edge of the wing here, it just looks really clean. All of the feathers are the same length. And also, look at the head. It's not really a bright pink or red. It's more of a grayish color. So this is actually a juvenile turkey vulture. So this bird would have been born over the summer, just a few months old now. Here's another raptor with the long tail. So again, we should be thinking accipiter. But is it a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk? Well, the tail looks pretty squared off to me. The wings look somewhat more short and rounded and a fairly small head. So this is another sharp-shinned hawk. If we compare that to this bird, looks like the head's a little bit larger. And also the tail looks a bit rounded. It's almost like the outer tail feathers end here. And then you can see it's more rounded as it gets towards the tip. Also, the streaking on this bird, it looks like it's more concentrated on the upper breast, kind of a brown teardrop streaking, and that's also typical of this species. This is a juvenile Cooper's hawk. Here's a bird that's high overhead, and as we're coming into this mid-September time period, it's a very common one to see. From the overall shape, we should be thinking that this is a buteo, and we can look at those wingtips and see that they look quite pointed. And also, if we look at the tail, we see that there's a bold white stripe along it. So this is an adult broad-winged hawk. Here we have a photo with two raptors, and it looks like the top bird is larger than the bottom one, so we can suspect that it's maybe two different species. Let's start with the top bird. Here we see a bird that has a lot of brown horizontal streaking to the breast. We see a dark trailing edge to the wing, and we see a tail that's a combination of black and white. And this is actually an adult broad-winged hawk. Also notice that the wingtip is quite pointed, only made up of 4 feathers on that wingtip. And we also do not see any dark patagial bars. So from the shape, we can assume that it's a buteo, and then from those other field marks with the horizontal brown streaking and the pattern of the tail, we know that it's a broad-winged hawk. Now, let's take a look at the bottom bird. How does it differ from the upper bird? The one thing that stands out to me is that it has a much longer tail. And this upper bird, it has its tail really fanned out, so maybe it's hard to do a direct comparison. But this bottom bird just has a really long tail. Also notice the difference in the color of the tails. On the top bird, the stripes are black and white. On this bottom bird, it's more of black and gray. So maybe that's another distinguishing mark we can look at. If we look at the streaking on the underside of the body of this bottom bird, we see that it's teardrop streaking that's more concentrated on the upper breast. And then as we get down towards the belly, hardly any streaking at all. We also see that it's got a somewhat large head and kind of long, lanky wings to it. So this bottom bird is an accipiter. It is a Cooper's hawk, a juvenile Cooper's hawk. If we look at this raptor, we see that it's a combination of browns and splotchy whites underneath. We see that it has a really big head with a large bill, and we see that the head and tail stick out about the same amount. So this is a large, dark bird. We should be thinking eagle for this, and in mid-September, we should be thinking bald eagle, along with the fact that the splotchy white is all over the underside, especially here in the wing pit area. If you see a lot of white here, that should be telling you bald eagle rather than golden eagle, which is a species we also see later on in the season. Another thing we can look at here to help us age the bird is the trailing edge to the wing. So we can see those longer retained juvenile feathers along with a few shorter feathers that have already been replaced. Remember, the juvenile feathers that it has for its first year are slightly longer than the feathers that it replaces those with. So with the color and the pattern of the wings, we know that this is a second-year bald eagle. Here we have another hawk, and just from the overall shape, we should be thinking that this looks like a buteo. It doesn't have the really long tail of the accipiters. It's more well-proportioned. Here we see that it has a lot of orange underneath, here in the body and in the wing coverts, but then the actual flight feathers of the wing and tail have that distinctive black and white barred pattern. Another thing we can look at is the shape of the wingtips, and if we count the feathers that make up the wingtip, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you look at the wingtip, especially at the bottom of the photo here, it's more of a blunt or squared off wingtip, which is also indicative of this species, which is adult red-shouldered hawk. Here's another hawk that's essentially the same shape as the last one. And if we look at those wingtips, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feathers making up the wingtip, giving it a more squared off appearance. Another thing we see that I haven't talked about yet in this video is as you look towards the wingtip in this area here or down here, before you get to the black of the actual wingtips here, you see kind of a translucent crescent or a pale crescent, you sometimes hear it called. And that is a good field mark for this species that you can see from quite far away. And it's something that both adults and juveniles show. This is another red-shouldered hawk, but whereas the last one was an adult with that really distinctive plumage with orange and black and white barring, we see the juvenile red shoulders like this are a bit more plain underneath. It does have some marking on the underside of the body here, but overall just doesn't have that really distinctive coloration that the adults show, but the shape is the same, the wingtip shape is the same, and they have those translucent crescents. And if we look at the tail of this bird, we see that it's pretty plain with some barring. Looks like it's lost a couple tail feathers and has new ones growing in. Here's a hawk that going on the overall shape. We see kind of a well-proportioned shape with a somewhat medium-length tail. This is a buteo. We see the dark patagial bars and the belly band. And we also see a dark trailing edge to the wing and a red tail. So that makes this an adult red-tailed hawk. This bird has really pointed wingtips, so right away we should be thinking falcon. Now if we look underneath, this bird has a lot of dark streaking on the underside. And we also see that the tail is dark with some white bands. Those are good field marks for this species, which is merlin. Merlins and American kestrels are our two small falcons. The way to tell them apart is that merlins are darker underneath, they have more dark streaking, and they also fly in a much more aggressive way. They have more attitude, we would say, just really powerful flyers, whereas kestrels are a little less powerful looking when they fly. They kind of mosey along and get blown by the wind more, but merlins are all attitude and all business, but really they're about the same size. There are two small falcons, and then we have our one larger falcon, which is the peregrine falcon. And as we came into the mid-September period, we started to see more and more of this. Here we have a group of hawks circling on a thermal. We sometimes call this a kettle. And the species that we see do this in mid-September is broad-winged hawk. So these are all broad-winged hawks migrating in big groups. And the broadwings really come through in a couple-week window. We get them in small numbers from the beginning of September, but there's really a 2 or 3 week window that we get essentially all of them for the season, and then they're done. And they go all the way to South America, so they have a really long migration, and they got to get where they're going. Here's a hawk that's coming towards us, but it's really good photo quality, so let's analyze what we're seeing. Even though it's coming at us, we still see that the tail looks really long. And we can see that the outer tail feathers, which fold underneath, look like they're shorter than the central tail feathers that extend all the way out to here. If we look at the streaking on the underside of the body, we see that it's kind of a vertical teardrop streaking that's more concentrated on the upper breast. And then as you get down here to the belly, it's more just plain white. So those field marks together make this a juvenile Cooper's hawk. Here's a hawk with more of a medium length tail and well proportioned. We should be thinking buteo, but we do not see dark patagial bars and we do not see a belly band. So let's not think red tail for this one. If we look at the wingtips, somewhat pointed, maybe only 4 feathers making up the wingtip, and just a little bit of brown streaking on the breast area that starts all the way up at the upper breast. So this is a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And here's what the top side of the juvenile broad-winged hawk looks like. Not really anything super distinctive about it, just kind of plain brown overall with some whitish highlights to it, maybe some banding on the tail, but overall nothing too distinctive to be looking for. The wingtips do look a bit pointed, and if you saw this bird in person as it turned, you'd be able to see that even better. And here's our last photo for the video. Looking at this bird, first thing that jumps out to me is that the wingtips are pointed, so we should be thinking falcon. We look at the head and we see that distinctive facial pattern. We also see some vertical brown streaking here and banded tail feathers. This is a female American kestrel. All right, those were the photos from the first half of September for the 2023 Ashland Hawk Watch. Stay tuned for photos from the rest of the season coming up. From Lyco Birds, this is David Brown. Thanks for watching.